Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's episode of A New Thing. Excited to be here. As you guys know, my fourth anniversary with all of you is coming up tomorrow, and I thought a great way to test how much you guys still love me is to think of a scenario. And I want to think of this scenario in particular. This is Stephen Cliffgard Lee. He's a Lutheran pastor in Illinois, and he was indicted, arrested last week with or 2 weeks ago with all the Trump indictments and everything like that. And his congregation paid his bail for him. How amazing is that? And I really like to believe that all of you, if I was involved in some political scheme where I got indicted and then put in jail in another state, that all of you, because you love me so much, would definitely pay my bail. And if you wouldn't, you have to ask yourself why. Why do you hate me so much? Why? What did I ever do to you? Anyway, I just thought that was funny. We're actually going to be talking about megachurches today. I'm going to be looking at an article about that. And before we do that, I wanted to read Titus 1 verses 10 through 16 and chapter 2 verse 1 because I think that it's a helpful way of kind of framing what I'm going to be talking about. So this is Paul's letter to Titus, and this is what he says. He says, "For there are many rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced because they are disrupting whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain. One of Crete's own prophets has said it, 'Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons.' The saying is true. Therefore rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or to the merely human commands of those who reject the truth. To the pure all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. In fact, both their minds and consciences are corrupted. They claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good." And then chapter 2, verse 1 says, "You, however, must teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine." So I want to talk about this because I think that there's a lot, obviously, of debates and fighting among churches and among all sorts of different things as to what way is best. And I think that oftentimes when we do this, right, we are very strong in our beliefs, and that's not bad. It's good to be strong in your beliefs. I think it's bad to be not strong in some beliefs, but you never want to be so strong that you just shut out any other possible way of viewing something, right? You have to understand that, at least give your opponents or people you're engaging with the benefit of the doubt that they're not idiots, which is sometimes hard to do because generally we tend to view people as idiots. But for this lesson, I'm just going to move myself up there. I wanted to talk about this because I read this article called "American Megachurches Are Thriving by Poaching Flocks. Denominations are out, brand identity and good vibes are in." This is from The Economist. Now, I actually want to say that I saw this and everyone on Twitter was all frothing at the mouth. Problem is that this is behind a paywall, so for most people you can't read it. And that title is not really what it talks about in the article, because poaching is like when you show up and you steal other people's members, right? I don't think that's what that might happen and certainly does, but I don't think it's not like a conscious effort on the part of a lot of megachurches, I think, to steal members from other places, and we'll talk about that. I think that reveals actually a lot more about Americans and what we want, and the misguided way I think that some people are searching for churches, and also how some churches, in order to increase their numbers, do misguided things. But I first wanted to talk about this because in this, Paul is writing to Titus, a leader of a church, and he's telling them what you have to do in order to keep order, right? And he's saying that you have to keep people accountable to the teachings of Christ. You have to tell them what is true, and also that you need to get people away who aren't doing things, or correct people who have wrong opinions. So, for instance, right here, right, you have this mentioning about the circumcision group. Now, the circumcision group was this early group in Christianity that believed that everyone had to be circumcised, all men obviously, had to be circumcised in order to become Christians. This is something Paul rejects. This is something that lots of the early church rejects. Like the Bible rejects this type of thing, like the John and Peter and all these other people, right? But Paul really goes after this because it was basically a belief that something you do endows righteousness to you. And Paul says, no, that's not what it's about, right? Galatians is all about this. That's really the core of Galatians. And that's one of Paul's earliest letters. So he's really big on saying, don't give them the time of day because they're going to teach false doctrine. And they do this in order to, I guess, from Paul's experience, to get things from people, right? For dishonest gain, power, money, whatever. And he quotes one of Crete's own prophets, and this is a guy named Epimenides. And he says that Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons. Now, there's a lot of debate about, like, is it because Titus is on Crete, and so he's talking about this? Or is it kind of this thing where it's like in-house, where you have this idea that when we're in-house, all of the people that are like us, you can't trust them, right? You can't just trust someone because they say that they're a Cretan. You have to actually, have to think about who it is, right? And you can't just trust them based on what they say that they are. And so, Paul says to rebuke them, to get them to turn. And then he'll say they pay no attention to Jewish myths or to merely human commands of those who reject the truth. And to the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. In fact, both their minds and consciences are corrupted. They claim to know God, but their actions deny him. They are detestable, disobedient, unfit for doing anything good. Now, I think so many of us, especially people who are really into denominational wars or theology wars, see like this as being everyone who disagrees with them is falling into this category, right? That if you are not completely in agreement with me, then this is what you are. And I want to make it clear that I like to have fun. I do like to razz and make fun of people, but I definitely don't believe that. Like, I believe you can be of good conscience and be kind of all over the Christian spectrum when it comes to beliefs, as long as they are within the historic faith of the church and through the Nicene Creed and things like that. I really think that we can have pretty strong disagreements about things and not have to call into question each other's salvation. But Paul tells him, you, however, must teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine. And then he talks actually about teaching, goes through a whole list of older women, older men, younger women, younger men, slaves, and things like that, and teaches them actions, actually, really more so than doctrine. But I think that this is what it's interesting here. He's like, this is what is appropriate to sound doctrine, right? So good faith leads to people acting this way. Self-control, love, endurance, things like that. So I bring this up because I saw this article from The Economist called American Megachurches Are Thriving by Poaching Flocks. And I'm going to read it, actually, and we're going to go through it paragraph by paragraph and kind of think about these things from a Christian perspective. So this is what it says. It says, earplugs are available should the music get too loud. Sure enough, the volume, not to mention the tattooed front woman and bobbing crowd, evokes a country rock concert. Only the lyrics suggest otherwise. Fill it all up with Jesus. Afterwards, a pastor in a t-shirt and high-top sneakers, I wish I could wear a t-shirt and high-top sneakers. I wish I could get away with that. Compares an Old Testament parable to a rom-com. That's fine, right? I mean, that's what happens in normal churches. Everyone makes jokes and tries to relate things to things that people know. Donations are solicited by QR code. The service is entertaining, and for many first-timers, unlike anything they expected of church. What's so funny to me is I know kind of like this is to me so much of what church is now in the United States that it's funny that for many people who have never been to a place like this that they're like, wow, I never expected church to be. I feel like that was acceptable in the 2000s and the early 2010s, but like these days, I remember in my worship class in seminary, my professor had us look at like demographic information, and we saw that most churches in the United States are small, right? So most churches that exist are small churches, which I can't remember how it's. I'd like to say it's like 200 or less members, right? So we're a small church, fine, good even. That's what I think. But most Americans attend mega churches, so it's like, and that's churches with more than 2,000 or more members. Like that's like the most Americans who go to church attend big churches, but most churches are small. So you have this really weird dichotomy, right? Like it's like that most people think of church as being like with a bunch of people. That's what you want, but in actuality, most churches are small, but most Americans attend those big ones. It's a very interesting kind of paradox there. So anyway, all that to say is that like it's not. I guess if they've never been to church before, this would be shocking because it's not like you see in the movies. But at the same time, this is actually the experience for most people in churches. And this says, "Welcome to Life Church, one of America's largest megachurches, headquartered near Oklahoma City. Really, it's a chain of churches with 44 sites across 12 states. Every weekend, around 80,000 people attend one of the 170 services in person. Most with a pre-recorded sermon by Senior Pastor Craig Groeschel. A junior pastor acts as an in-person MC, and worship band plays live. The whole thing blends seamlessly and is streamed online too." And this is a map that I got from Wikipedia, from the Life Church page, and you can see the states here, right? It's really big in the southern Midwest, Florida, and New York. And yeah, that may mean that makes sense. I'm surprised they don't have any plants in California, but maybe they're planning to it. Churches have closed as it continues. It says, churches have closed as the proportion of Americans who call themselves Christian has fallen from 76% in 2010 to 64% in 2020. But most of America's 1750 megachurches, all Protestant and mostly evangelical churches with at least 2,000 worshipers, are thriving. Between 2015 and 2020, their congregations grew by a third on average, turning younger and more multiracial, according to the Hartford Institute for Religion Research, a think tank in Connecticut. After a COVID dip, we're in growth mode, says Brian Tomei, pastor of Crossroads, a 9-site church based in Ohio. Things are fun right now. So this is Brian Tomei. I've never heard of him, but never heard of Crossroads. But it seems like kind of one of those statewide megachurch things. Like for us, that would be like Liquid, and in the past, something like Zarephath, where it's just kind of located just in one state. And but it is a megachurch, right, where you have lots of people coming every week. Something to note here, right, is that this is the growing, like one of the few growing movements in American Christianity, right? Most churches are declining or stabilizing. Most are declining, some are stabilizing, but a few are actually growing. So an example of this, weirdly, is the most people wouldn't think of them this way, but the Seventh-day Adventists are actually growing, which is not something that you would usually think about or see, right? But that's happening. It's one of the churches that are growing. Evangelical churches, mostly mega churches, are also growing, and it's interesting, right? Because it's what are we thinking about? But anyway, fewer bodies, and they have this interesting graph, right? Fewer bodies, many members. The United States change in church attendance by size of congregation, 2015 to 2020. Percent of total, right? So you actually see mostly in really small churches, it's declined quite a bit. And that's probably because these churches just aren't really feasible anymore. In a lot of the middle ones, you'll see that like that they're basically the same. Like there isn't really a difference between 100 members and 250 members. Pretty much everyone is kind of staying in the way it was, and slightly more in these ones. And then in the 1500 plus, you actually have a huge growth that's taken place, right? So in big churches, you have lots of more people attending these types of things. Concentration among churches accelerated as costs rose in the 1970s, notes Mark Chaves of Duke University. Smaller ones lost members. Though evangelicals aimed to convert non-believers, about 3/4 of those who joined megachurches were already practicing. We like to think that we're reaching atheists. We're reaching some, but the truth is that the body of Christ is consolidating, says Mr. Tomei. So what's happening, right, is that a lot of these churches are big on outreach, but really most people who attend them are people who already identify as Christian in some way and go. Now, I think that the way that The Economist reads this is by poaching flocks. I think most of these people aren't coming from other churches. I think most of them are identifying as Christian, not really attending an in-person church, maybe loosely affiliated with one, but then moving to the megachurch for other reasons, and we'll see what some of those reasons are because The Economist talks about them. But I don't think like they come in and steal people. Like I think that most of them get cultural Christians really and get them more involved, or people who aren't Christian and come. I actually think that that's one of the real strengths. I have real problems with megachurches too, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I do want to at least give credit. One of the strengths of megachurches is that I think they're really good at getting people in the door and exposing them to Christ. The problems come afterwards with that, and we'll talk about kind of what goes on. With more money and more hands, megachurches can innovate. Though they account for just 0.5% of all churches and 7% of churchgoers, their influence. I wonder where they get that number, because depending on how, like I said before, depending on how you quantify megachurch, most people actually go to big churches. So I'd be interested. They don't cite that number. Maybe they get it from the Hartford Research Institute. I'm not sure. But I remember it's interesting that you see 7%, maybe 7% worldwide. I don't know. I'd imagine it's the United States what they're talking about, but I'm not sure. Anyway, their influence is felt in the music played elsewhere and the popularity of their TED Talk style sermons, says Scott Thuma of the Hartford Institute. So it must be the Hartford Institute. Nearly all the top contemporary worship songs between 2010 and 2020 came from just 4 megachurches. Now let me see. That's Elevation, Hillsong, and Bethel. I don't know what the 4. Maybe Sovereign Grace. I don't know. Well, but those 3 are the big 3 and stuff like that. And we don't play their music here at church. You can ask my wife why. Their success illustrates what it takes to compete. And I think that word compete is important. In a dynamic spiritual marketplace. Again, I want you to notice how they're talking about these things. Bill Hybels, a megachurch pastor felled by sexual misconduct allegations in 2018, was said to parrot Peter Drucker, a management guru. What does the customer consider valuable? It says value, but or what does the customer consider value? I don't know. It makes more sense to say valuable. Sorry, Peter Drucker. Andre Audet, a political scientist in Monmouth College in Illinois, found that 4/5 of evangelical Christians have shopped around for a church more than any other group, right? Because what you do is you show up in a new place and you look around for a church that meets your needs. Or your church that you're currently attending stops meeting your needs, and so you go looking for another church. What would Drucker say of the faith customer? Well, 2 trends stand out. They want to choose their level of engagement, which megachurches make easy. This is where the problems begin. Those craving connection can join any number of small groups. Life.Church hosts a club for Dungeons and Dragons fans, gamers connecting and growing closer to Christ. Love that. You know, it's a shame I'm a solo pastor, because if I was a associate or something, that would be my whole ministry. Others like anonymity. There's more pressure to donate and serve at smaller churches. Megachurch members show up and contribute less per capita. And this is the problem. This is the big problem for me. One of the big problems is you see that the way that people talk about it is, one, that they're talking about it like it's a business. Church is not a business, all right? It's not a business. We don't view church plants as entrepreneurial efforts. We view this as being a servant of Christ. So when you're a servant of Christ, you can't view it like it's a business, right? One soul saved is more worthwhile than being able to support a church where everyone just says that they're a Christian and isn't, even if you're at 5,000 people a week, right? That is the, if you want to talk about market belief, right? The point is not current trend or current greatness. It's how many people in the future are going to be impacted, like eternally, because eternal impact matters way more than 20 years of a church that has 10,000 plus members, right? But no one actually cares, or no one's actually being changed, or anything like that, right? And I think that this is a big part of megachurches. Their appeal is that you can just show up and not do anything. And I don't mean to be rude to people who attend megachurches, but like that's generally what I see is one of the problems that megachurches have is they just burn through volunteers. And they make them go and do these ridiculous things. Like one of the ones in our area has people show up at like 4 a.m. to set up for church in the morning. It's like that's not, and they're not paid, right? This is all volunteer work. And the problem is I don't see the fruit doctrinally from stuff like this. Like I and I don't mean to say this in a way that I think I'm smarter than everyone. I'm not, right? I don't think I'm smarter, but I know working with some of these churches in the past that I could run circles around these guys who run these churches theologically, right? But they, unlike me, are, I think, way more talented when it comes at speaking, way more talented in engaging, right? They're able to take the Bible and make it really livable for people, even though it might not be accurate to what the Bible is saying, right? They're able to communicate that. And some of their things that they do are good. Like they do wonderful ministries a lot of the time when it comes to like reaching out to the poor through giving them things, or they talk about here, right? So it says the weakening of denominations. 2/5 of megachurches are non-denominational. I will say about that, as you know, I don't believe in non-denominational churches. I just believe that they're lying Baptists, right? Because you'll never find a non-denominational church that baptizes infants. I mean, I'm sure you can, but they're incredibly rare. Most of them are just Baptists without any of the baggage of putting that name on their building, or, I'll be honest, without the history. And I think that makes them weaker for it. I disagree with Baptists on baptism, but I'm going to give them credit that at least they root themselves into tradition. I think the non-denominations are a tradition, but they just pretend not to be. The rest tend to downplay theirs and emphasize their own brand. Life Church is affiliated with the ECC, Evangelical Covenant Church, but few congregants realize that. Todd Mullins of Christ Fellowship Church, a church with 14 sites in Florida, estimates that about half his flock were once Baptists or Catholics, and the other half unchurched. So the Baptists just left the SBC or stopped going to an SBC church and then started going there because it's really the same thing for them. And Catholics, right? I mean, you see this a lot in Jersey, where they come out of the Catholic Church and they want something completely radical and different, and it's easy to get that completely in a megachurch. And the other half is unchurched, which is great. I'm glad that they're getting people in through the door. I think that's what they're really good at. But you'll see here that I would argue that they are a denomination, right? When you have 14 sites, you actually are a denomination. You have 14 different churches. They're not all the same church. They are institutionally, just like the PCUSA, right? But like they're all individual places with their own cultures. And you can see this even in New Jersey. Liquid Church is a good example, right? I had a friend who worked at the Somerville campus, and it's very different in Somerville than it is from other places in Jersey, and that's fine, right? And they have their own leader there. Sure, they all viewed the same sermon from one central location, but like the real pastor there was the campus pastor, right? He's the one who's actually going to show up at your home or visit you or talk with you about things and stuff like that, right? So consolidation will level off at some point, as says Mr. Chavs. And today's winners will probably not look the same in the future. Back in 2006, he found that the largest churches retained their top spot for about 20 years before being overtaken. Growing has stresses of its own. Mr. Tomei says he stopped sharing attendance numbers with Outreach magazine, which ranks congregations by size, because he felt like a chief executive answering to the stock market. I'm not in corporate America, he says. I'm in a church. Now, I will say he also referred earlier that he's in growth mode, the way that you would in a business. But I think this leads us to the problem, and this is how I'll end here, is the importance of sound doctrine in churches is that it keeps us focused. And you can have sound doctrine in a megachurch, but the point is that the point of the church, right, the point of growing people is not just to entertain. It's not just to get as many people as you can, right? Paul says here, right, rebuke people, and when you rebuke people, they tend to leave, right? That's been my experience, and that's fine, right? That for me, from a Christian level, it's like, all right, you were rebuked, you had an opportunity to turn to Christ, you chose not to, and so it doesn't really bother me where you go. Like that's kind of my whole. That's very antithetical to a lot of what people want in churches, but that's the biblical message. And I think that as Christians, we have to hold our churches to a standard where we are actually being challenged, growing, but not growing on our terms, growing on Christ's terms, being asked to carry our cross, right? Do new things, be challenged, and to reach out and do evangelism and all these other things. I think that the more more church can make you uncomfortable, and I don't mean uncomfortable in the sense of dominating or of abusing or anything like that, but just uncomfortable in calling you to do things that Christ wants you to do, but you really don't want to do it. Not giving you an option to be anonymous, right? Not giving you an option not to serve or to tithe. These are things you should be doing, right? And really stressing that is, I think, the goal of church, and the idea that if we're going to hold people to sound doctrine and make it lead to good behavior, that's what it should be. So the challenge for the smaller churches like us is, how do we do that in a way that's appealing to people but still challenges them? And for megachurches is, how do we start doing that? Because they're really good at appealing to people, but they're not good, in my experience, of growing in the faith. And even their own leadership is usually not very sound on doctrine. And it's usually by the grace of God that that the churches don't become dens of apostasy, although that sometimes does happen, like with the big three, Hillsong, Elevation, and Bethel. Whatever. That's it. All right. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. I will see you guys next week, and of course on Sunday in worship. Have a awesome day. Peace out.